Thank you for joining us for our May edition of the IrisBG Coffee Chats. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Mari Rystan, and I'm the Marketing Director and Product Manager of IrisBG. As usual, Avery Rystan, who's the founder and CEO of IrisBG, is also here today. I also have the pleasure to introduce you to Laura Murray, our newest addition to the IrisBG team. And today she will help me moderate the session, and I can promise we will get to know her better at the next coffee chat in June. On the agenda today, we have Avery Mangiameli at Powell Gardens, who will share her 4 sheets method of organizing project status and delivery, including data export and item management, how to customize label types and label status. We will see how much time there will be for an open discussion today. Avery will try to answer some of your questions during her presentations, and we will round off with the Q&A. Since we have a lot to go through today, I'll skip my usual intro and just say that we hope you get inspired, make some new connection, and perhaps that we together become a bit wiser. This map is an overview of all the institutions you here today represent. And to further learn a bit more about who's here today, we have our usual little poll. The first question is related to your experience with IrisBG, and the second question is asked on behalf of Avery. As usual, we have a good representation of all experience levels of IrisBG here, which I always find is very great to see. And as expected, nobody use the plant tags just for annuals. And interesting to see that some of you actually don't use any tags, but still wants to be here. That's promising. Maybe you will start after today. So without any further ado, I will give the word to Avery Mangiameli of Powell Gardens, who will talk about how they do labeling at Powell.
Okay, so as Mari mentioned, my name is Avery Mangiameli. I am the Plant Records Registrar at Powell Gardens in Kansas City, Missouri in the United States. So we have been using IrisBG to really help with our plant labels and our plant tags. But the overall goal for today, as you might have noticed from the poll, is to try to help everyone, whether you already have plant tags in your garden or whether you don't. Hopefully my process and my method today will be able to help anyone along any step of this process, just whether it's how I use Iris or something like that. Also, you might hear me mention plant labels and plant tags, but they're essentially the same thing. It's just a different wordage. So before we dive in, I'm going to do a brief history of Powell Gardens to help you know where we're coming from. So in 1948, the land was acquired by George E. Powell Sr. and his family. And they lived there and they farmed the land, but George also had business aspirations. So in 1969, they decided to donate the land to the Boy Scouts of America so George could focus on his business. And we actually still have several buildings and several signs on the property today from when the Boy Scouts used it. My office is actually in one of those buildings. So then in 1984, a local college came forward with an idea of how to better utilize the land. And then in 1988, Powell Gardens, as we know it today, was established. And then fast forward 30 years, we now have 8 separate gardens across 175 acres. And that's actually just the acreage that's available to the public. In total, our property is 970 acres. And we have plans and ideas for a lot of that land. So looking at this timeline, we can also add that in 2020 is when we acquired IrisBG. So looking at that, we have 30 years of records that we are trying to catch up on and make sure that they are accurately represented. I should also note that in the time before we had Iris, there was a lady named Marie working on our records principally. And then after we got Iris, there was another lady named McKenna who took over. And then last year in 2021, I took over. So not only do we have 30 years of records we're catching up on, we also have 3 hands that these records have now passed through. So that's kind of been an ongoing project, is making sure that our records are as accurate as possible, that all of the references match up, things like that from not only the long time, but also the 3 different hands. So I might mention that project as we move forward today. So something important to look at before we get too deep into this is what actually our labels look like. So here at Powell, we have 3 standard layouts that we use, and each of these has a different purpose. So the one on the left is our standard 3x5 plant tag. It's got the basic identification information on it. We like to include the family name and the native range as well. It helps guests draw connections between plants and just give a little more education. And it also has our logo on there as well. The 2 plant labels on the right side are fairly new, and they're about 1x3 in size, so they're a bit smaller. And the purpose for that was so that in specialty areas, you don't look like you're looking at a sea of tags. You're still able to see the actual plants there. So the one on the top is for our display greenhouse, where you're up close and personal with the plants, but still has a lot of that identification information. And then the one on the bottom is for our award-winning iris beds, because again, you want to focus on the plant more than too much of the identification information. So keeping this in mind as we move forward today is going to help us kind of know where we're going. This is also an important first step when you're considering making labels. Once you've developed a format that you like, that will help influence a lot of the decisions you make throughout the process today. So keep that in mind if you are still, if this is still an ongoing project for you. So the first thing we are going to do is go over the basic overall process we will look at today. So the first step, kind of after you already have your formatting decided on, is for making a basic plant tag. The first step is receiving a list from the gardener on what plant tags need to get made. The second step is pulling that information from IrisBG. The third step is inputting that information to the engraver. And the fourth step is making the actual tags. So today we are really going to focus on the first 2 steps. Once you get into the engraving process, it gets a lot more technical, and especially because throughout our very large community, I know there are so many different engravers and labeling machines and things that we use. So I don't want to get too specific into what we specifically use. That being said, if you have more questions or want to get more technical, please feel free to reach out to me after this. So any big questions before we get started? Right, so one question I'm seeing is, why don't we have the accession number on the label? That's actually something I've been thinking about. I know one of our gardeners prefers to hand write it on the back of our tags. To be honest, that's a great question. I'm not sure why they haven't instituted it in the past, but perhaps that will be something we do moving forward. That's a great question, though. Anything else before we keep going? All right. So jumping into step 1, receiving a list from the gardener. So one thing that I have found that works really well for us is using Excel sheets for our gardeners to submit requests for accessions and plant tags. So in Microsoft Teams, we'll have a folder that's full of Excel templates, and then they can make a copy of that that they actually submit to me. And kind of the purpose of that is letting the gardeners know what information I need from them. You may have a different process that works, but that's what we're looking at. And basically it's just for them to give information to me so I know what to do where to go moving forward, what plant tags they need, things like that. So assuming that we have a list from our gardener, that is our first step. And you can also see that it includes, this template has what information I need to be able to find that accession in IrisBG to make a tag. And this is not for plant tags that don't have an existing accession. That would be a different new accession template. So once we have a request from our gardener, we can dive into a method that I've called the 4 sheets. This is a method that I have found I have kind of developed over the last year that has helped immensely, mainly just for organization purposes. You by no means need to start using it, but I highly recommend. And again, it's just what I have found that really works for me. So kind of the term sheets that I'm talking about here is within, the goal is to have all requests, like one request is one Excel document. And then within that one document, we will develop 4 separate sheets, as you can see what is circled down at the bottom there. So if you're not familiar with that and you want more specifications, please feel free to reach out to me. But that's kind of the verbiage that I'm using. I'm referencing one entire Excel document, but 4 separate sheets within that document. So diving into this method, the first sheet that will kind of start out our document is going to be directly from our gardener, what they submit to me. And I'm actually going to rename that sheet from gardener just to keep it straight. So this is an actual snippet of a request that I received from one of our gardeners in our visitor center area. So my big goal with this sheet is to try to keep it as untouched as possible. The big goal here is to just have a reference point, to have something moving forward that we have on record is what they submitted. So if there's any questions or something we're not sure about later, we have a good reference point. So the first thing I want to do with this is I'm going to make a duplicate of that sheet, which will become our second sheet. And I'll rename that one our working copy. This is the sheet that I can then kind of clean up a little bit. Again, I want to try to keep as much of the information consistent as we can. But, you know, like you might notice from gardener sheet that some of the common names have cultivar in them, or the common name is actually the genus species, things like that, cleaning it up a little bit. The last thing I want to do is alphabetize by genus species. This is just going to help moving forward when we actually get into IrisBG. Okay, so that is our first 2 sheets, and we are getting ready to go into IrisBG. So are there any questions at this point before we dive in?
Yeah, we do have a question here from Jenna. I'm not sure how you pronounce your name. She's wondering if your display labels in the in-house is engraved, in the greenhouse, I assume, if they are engraved.
Mm-hmm. So are you talking about like internal, like production annuals?
Jenna, if you'd like, you can unmute yourself and answer.
Yeah, my question was, are you using like an in-house engraver for your label making, or are you outsourcing to a printer?
Right, sure. No, we actually have the engraver in-house. It's actually in my office. So yeah, anything that needs engraved comes through me and gets engraved here, which definitely helps with the process.
Thank you. Hopefully I can reach out to you later.
Sure, and I'm going to touch on it a little bit towards the end. We're not going to get into too technical, but I'll talk about the basics a little bit. All right, so we will go ahead and move forward. So we've got our 2 sheets, and as I mentioned, we're ready to move to step 2, which will be pulling the information from IrisBG. So we've carried over our working copy here on the left, as you can see, we just talked about. And one aspect of IrisBG that I have really come to enjoy using is the item management feature. So on the left-hand side under collections, you'll see item management. I really like this feature because if you're not familiar with it, you can select a specific location in your garden, and then you can see all of the accessions really quickly for quick reference. And then you can select individual accessions to use. I like it a lot better than running reports because it gives me more control over what information I pull. But again, just my preference. So as you can see, we are going to go into the location specified by our gardener on our working copy. And then we're going to go through and we will select the accessions that they requested. So as you can see, our first one we found Ethereum Neponicum Regal Red, as they said on the working copy. And we will continue to go through and select all of the specimens that they listed here for us. So then after we have selected all of those, we'll go up to Create Labels tab. We'll select a label type and we'll export that information. And we are really going to dive into the label type and what that means and how we can customize that in just a little bit. But this is kind of big picture where we're going. We will use the label type to export the information for those accessions. So after we have done that, as a quick recap, we have taken our list from our gardener. We've cleaned it up a little, made a working copy, and then we've used the working copy to pull the information from IrisBG. And after we exported that information, we get our third document, generated data. So this, once we export it from item management, it will actually generate a new Excel document. And as I mentioned, one thing I like to do is go into that, copy all of that information, and create our third sheet on the original document. Again, just to keep it all in one space, rather than having two separate documents. So now we have our third sheet that we will label our generated data, and this comes exactly from IrisBG. As a quick note as well, the different columns of information that it generated, I chose. It was customized. So that's one thing that we will get into in just a moment of how you can actually do that. So along with the information we exported, it also gave us our accession numbers and the location, which are good for reference. So once we have this generated data sheet, we're going to make a duplicate of that, which will become our fourth and final sheet, our track sheet. This is the sheet that I will print a copy off for my records, and I'll print a copy to give to the gardener with the new tags so they know what they're getting and where it goes. So with the track sheet, I'm just going to clean it up a little from our generated data sheet. The gardener doesn't really need to know the family or the distribution, so we'll take those out. And I also like to add a column on the left that shows the tag made, just for quick reference of that's actually what they're receiving. As I mentioned earlier, some of our location references need to be cleaned up from what the gardeners actually use versus what was written in our database years ago. So that's the two columns you see on the right as well, just for leaving a paper trail reference of what our locations are getting updated to say. So now we have our 4 sheets, and as a quick snapshot in our Excel document, of course there would be information in there, but that is the basics of what our 4 sheets will look like. That is very, very helpful. So we'll do a quick pause and ask for any questions, make sure nobody's too lost before we continue.
I think Peggy had one question. Why is species capitalized in your working list?
Sure. No specific reason. As I'm looking at it on our from gardener sheet, it looks like that's what they recorded. It was probably just a typo. But once we pull that information from Iris, you'll notice in the generated data sheet, it's corrected.
Sorry, is it just not easier to get the gardeners to request it either on Iris or as a label needed, and then go ahead and just print out all the requested labels rather than all these spreadsheets?
I mean, you can. What I found, I think I tried at the very beginning to just do a very simple process of using the information that they gave me to immediately make labels, but I was finding that the names that they give me weren't necessarily what we had in the system, so our labels were not consistent, things like that. This, as I mentioned, kind of using these 4 sheets helps for consistency, make sure that all of our labels, the information is coming directly from IrisBG instead of just hearsay. And at least in our system, this has helped to make sure that all of our labels remain consistent for the specific plants and things like that. Does that answer your question?
Not really. It just seems like you're handling the data a lot, whereas if it's already in Iris and they just request a label, we have different types of label, you know, standard label, a common names label that they can request. So then just automatically all the data that they require goes on whatever sort of label they request.
I think Jamie had a couple good comments about this in the chat. Jamie, did you want to unmute? And
yeah, that's fine. So I was suggesting, so for our gardeners, I'm lucky if they're able to look up data in Iris. They just don't have the time or the practice using the system to be able to feel comfortable putting things in tasks or requesting labels directly through the system. For them, you know, there's a little bit of a disconnect between our ordering process and how they request plants to be ordered. Honestly, they use that part of the process more for their reference than they do our actual database. So for us, it's a little bit of a technological mishmash in terms of the processes. And I think it's great to be able to sort of see this stepwise process.
Yeah, I would say we are in a very similar state as Jamie. As I mentioned, like I've gotten handwritten lists from our gardeners before of them just walking through the garden saying this needs a plant tag, this plant tag's broken. So it keeps the gardeners in the gardens more than behind a computer, and also helps them not really need to know the technical aspect of IrisBG. That makes sense. I'm sure there probably is an easier way if they were to kind of have that knowledge and that ability, but this is the process we've found that works well for their schedules and for mine.
Thank you, Avery. I think we can continue and we can go back to this afterwards if there's time as well.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. So after we have our 4 sheets, again, just kind of touch base back to our finished labels. So you'll notice that these are the categories that are of information that we were able to pull from IrisBG. And that's why, because that's the information we need for our labels. So keeping this in mind that this is what we have, let's get a little bit more into customization. So I mentioned earlier label types. But in IrisBG under definitions, you can go to label types, and then this is where you actually can create a label type for your own usage. So as you can see, for quick reference, we have our 3x5 standard tag. And then under that, under the fields column is where we actually choose what information that includes. So these different label types, this is the information that when we select that, it'll export this chosen information. So it'll show you all the available fields you can choose from, and you can choose which one you want, which ones you want. You can also edit the order, and that's very helpful for us based on how we want that to put that information into our engraver. So that's something to keep in mind as well. But for example, looking at our 1x3 small tag, it's not going to include the family and the distribution because that's not something that goes on that tag. So the different label types allow you to customize the information that you pull from IrisBG. So another useful function of the different label types, some of you might recognize this screen, the accessions screen under the items tab, which allows you to keep track of the location of your accessions. But on the right-hand side under the status column, you'll also notice that there's a spot for a label type. So this allows you to keep track in your individual accessions what label type they have, how many of those labels they have, and the status of those labels. So for example, this magnolia has one of our 3x5 standard tags. And the OK status for our internal usage means that it's a new updated good tag in place. But you can also go in under definitions and edit the item stat or the label statuses. So you can make one that says broken, you can make one that says it's old, whatever helps and is good for your process. You can also update the label type here. So like if this magnolia had one of our small tags, you can keep track of that. So that has been a very, very good use of this tab for us. I've used it a lot. And then another factor of keeping this updated is if you prefer using reports, you can run reports on the different label statuses. You can go in this screen, choose your report, change the label status, export, and you'll get a list of all the accessions with that label status. If you prefer item management like I do, you'll notice after this is the same screen from earlier when we chose our Ethereum Niponicum, but if you go to one of the rightmost columns, it'll give you a quick snapshot of the label type and the label status associated with that. So again, that's a really quick, awesome, easy reference. Another cool function of item management for this purpose is you can do a quick batch update of the label types. For example, after I would make all of these new tags that got requested today, I could very easily go in and select all of those again and update their label type and label status all at once. So that has been a lifesaver as well. So you don't have to go into each session individually. Okay, so that's the real quick overview, and we can touch base real quick before we keep going. So I'll check for questions.
Yeah, you saw Jenna's question there.
Right, so the label in the item tab was in the label types under definitions. Does that answer that question?
Yes.
Yes, it does. You can continue, I think. Yeah.
All right, so just a quick recap where we're at in our overall process. So we received a list from our gardener using our first and our second sheets. And then we used that for step 2 to pull the information from IrisBG, which gave us our third and our fourth sheets. So now we are able to input our information into our engraver and then step 4, make the tags. So as I mentioned earlier, we're not going to get into too much specifics today, but I'll give you a really quick overview of our, engraver and our process. This is our engraver that we have in-house, the Gravitech LS100. The really good function of this engraver is we can engrave a wide variety of things. We can do different size plant labels. We can do name tags. We can do signs, things like that. It's worked really well for us so far. So then along with this engraver, we have this engraving program that goes along with it. So this is in that program, the screen we have created this template for our actual tags. And this is part of step 3, inputting information to the engraver. So inside this template, you'll notice the text with the bars are variables. So the position remains constant through all of our tags, but the actual text can change. So that's been a game changer helping with making tags. So going back to our generated data sheet, which is where we take the information from for our engraver, you can compare it with the actual input screen in our engraving program. So you'll notice the columns are set up in the same order. And that's the reason in our label types page, that's why they are set up that way, to match in our engraving program. So then we can just real quick and easily select all of that information at once and copy it directly into our engraving program. And then there, voila, are our tags ready to print. So again, there's the generated data sheet to compare, but it's been a lifesaver, been super easy once we have kind of figured out this process. So that is the basics of our engraver, but I know that it is a lot more technical when you really get into it. So if you have any other questions on that, please feel free to reach out to me. So then the next step after that is just to simply let the engraver do its thing and make the tags. And that's really the whole process. So real quick, these are some quick snapshots from our gardens with our new updated tags for this season. As you can see, just kind of a quick glance at these areas, you're not overwhelmed with the tags. And that was kind of the purpose of this design and this size. The font is still large enough and easy enough to read that when you're standing there, you don't have to look hard for the information, but it doesn't overwhelm your view of the beds. And it also helps the gardens feel cohesive when they're all the same formatting throughout the gardens for the most part. And also connecting back to the poll we took before we started, currently Powell Gardens only has plant tags like this for our perennials. Our annuals and our production team who help with those annuals, they just use the regular paper labels that kind of come with annual plants. We've discussed possibly making smaller tags for those, engraved tags for those, but it just kind of depends on the feasibility because they get switched out so often. But that is something we've discussed, and I will definitely keep in mind the accession numbers being included as well. Okay.
Thank you, Avery. This is a great presentation. We love that it's broken out into the 4 steps.